Hey folks, Dan here again. I hope y'all having a great GDC, mid-GDC. Um, I've got another demo here. It wasn't specifically created for GDC, but it just sort of worked out that timing-wise that it was ready for a GDC. So we just included it because we were like, hey, this is something that people might be interested in. And so you can totally go down to the booth and check out this project. But basically, the way that this worked out, this is a music stitching project, and what happened was a couple weeks ago or so, an internal project approached me, and they were like, "Hey, we've got this presentation thing that we're trying to do, and we want to use this music, but we need it to be edited for interactivity." And I think this is a common problem. I think this comes up a lot, where a studio, any studio, would have some licensed piece of music, probably linear, and in origin, and then need to make it interactive in some way. And so there are lots of strategies if you're starting out, or if you're working toward breaking into the industry. This is definitely one of the skills you want to have on point. You want to be able to edit your loops, and you want to be able to edit them very nicely. So in this case, they had this licensed piece of music. I think, if I remember correctly, when the Unreal Engine went from a subscription model to a free to download product, then they had this trailer, or like this short film, which was this story about a boy and his kite, and they had this beautiful piece of licensed music. But the licensed music was sort of built around this narrative, this story of these characters. And so they were like, hey, we have this music, we really like this music, and it fits our general narrative arc. We just need it to be more interactive. And the way that their presentation was set up is they had like a little choreographed scene, and then they would wait for user interaction. And then they would have another little sequence, and then wait for user interaction. And then they had like this longer choreographed sequence, and then they would wait for user interaction. And then this sort of ending, right? So I brought I didn't have a lot of time to work on this. This is where you want your editing skills up to par. And I kind of blew the designer's mind because I brought him in to the studio, and we just pulled up the music that he wanted to work with, and we started spotting moments of steady energy level. So when you're looking for like looping stuff, you want to look for those moments of like energy states. And you listen to the music, and you're like, hey, this window of time has a pretty steady energy state. Let's see if I can loop that. And I was able to edit some prototype loops for him that were seamless, to just sort of say, hey, does this sound good? It's seamless, but does it sound right? Or because this piece of music, and I'll show you in just a second, it's very moving. It's very arcing. It has a lot of energy movement, and so you're sort of looking for those windows where you can say, okay, this is a loopable section. This is a loopable section. This is a loopable section. So if I set everything up correctly, you should be able to hear this. This is Reaper, and I think, yeah. So this is the piece, the original linear piece. So far, it's pretty steady. There's a little bit of movement. This cello comes in. It's very, very pretty. So yeah, you can see that this original clip has been littered with my my edits from pulling it, segments out. But basically, okay, there's some moments you could probably spot where there are windows of inactivity, as it kind of worked out for this project, and this is something you always have to think about when you're editing loops, is that the user wasn't going to be sitting on the loops for a long time. They just had to figure out some simple thing to sort of move on to the next sequence. And so in this case, we just needed a short loop that was musical sounding enough, and one that we could then feel free to exit. And so so yeah, basically what I did was I have, okay, here's some non-looping sections where a sequence occurs, right? Here's my two short ones, and then my long one for that one sequence that's much longer, and then a finale, and then here I have my looping segments, and you can see if you spot, you can see I based on some feedback, I changed the timing of some of these, and I made like shorter versions or longer versions, etc. But basically, when approaching these edits, and this is important to sit down with a designer and sort of work these the sort of flow out with them. You want to make sure that your edits are serving the narrative of the project, right? So we wanted to retain that flow, but we wanted to give ourselves enough freedom to maybe rearrange it. For example, one of the one of the looping sections, which has a lower energy level, I actually pull from another part of the piece, and it's just like, hey, if we can edit this all together so it's smooth, it fits that flow, and it's musical and seamless, then we're good. And so let me set you up here so you can kind of hear how, and this is where you want your editing skills to be on point, because I have a situation where I have to have a seamless transition from one segment into my looping segment. Then the loop itself has to be seamless, and then exiting the loop into the next section also has to be seamless. So all those 3 points of transition have to be seamless. So yeah, so here, these were like, this was like easy, right? We were like, oh yeah, the piano part, that's very steady energy state. And then we have our loop. There we go. And then I'll take the repeat off so that it just transitions through. See, this is where I kind of cheat a little bit, right? I use the fact that it's seamless to itself for my transition into the next thing. Right? Alright. And then the cello starts coming in. The cello coming in, then we have the strings come in, and it's big and beautiful, and then we reach our last one, and then we have, our finale. Okay, so we've got all the segments worked out. The designer liked it. Like I said, there were just a few notes on the time of some of them, so I made a shorter version of that long segment, and I made actually made a longer version of the ending segment, but basically, there you go. And then one of the other problems that you can have when you're trying to sort of work out a music system is thinking about timing and time critical nature of your logic, right? So, and this is actually it's not a problem exclusive to audio. It just so happens that in a lot of cases, the rate at which audio logic happens is pretty high. the frequency is pretty high. So, but like any game that has, say, like a first-person shooter, for example, or a platform fighter, they need to process input at very high frequencies, much higher than other games might, right? So every system has their own sort of needs as far as timing critical logic. In the case of Unreal, one of the things you want to think about is currently the game thread logic is synchronized to your video render frame rate. So the rate at which the game thread ticks is synchronous to the rate at which the video render updates. And there are reasons why this is useful. It's very convenient for certain types of systems, but it's not always the best way. It's just the way it is right now. And so that's something we have to contend with as audio people approaching working with a game engine. You know, how often is our logic going to update? At what frequency? And do we have the convenience? Like, so in this case, I didn't have the convenience of a project that had a high frame rate. So I had to take that into account in my design. And so I chose a sort of stitching, sort of quilted design where I checkerboard a non-looping transition segment into a looping transition segment into a non-looping transition segment into a looping, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I decided to do was to not worry about, like it's common for people to think about transitioning from one music thing to the next music thing on like the boundaries of the music. And in this case, I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to think about that. Instead of trying to transition on the boundaries of the music, I wanted to let the system be flexible enough to transition at any time. So I didn't have to think about trying to be beat accurate or tick accurate. All I had to think about was lining my audio files up. And so, but basically the idea is this. If I have some introduction, say like an introduction segment, and I'm going into my loop A, say, then I just want, maybe I will be delayed in reacting to the end of the introduction. I don't want there to be a gap. And so what I do is I give myself padding. I say, okay, well, here's some extra bits of loop A. So once I'm past this threshold, then I have this margin of error right here to transition into loop A. And my only concern then is making sure that I start in loop A in time with this sort of conceptual boundary, right? This threshold here. And then similarly with loop A, I don't want to think about, you know, when I'm transitioning out of loop A. I just want to be able to say I'm ready to move when I get that user input, when I'm getting that input from whatever system is sending the transition, is saying cue the transition, then I just want to be able to act on that information. And so I include the loop as part of my transition segment, so that at any time during the loop, all I have to do is make sure that they're synchronized in line with each other, and I think that's a much easier problem than trying to calculate beats over time or anything like that. So then I can just transition any time into the transition segment. I play my transition segment, and just like my first transition segment, I just add a little bit of padding so I give myself that margin of error in reaction time when I transition into the next loop, and so on and so forth. So this is the idea that I go into this problem trying to solve. All right, so close down Reaper. No, we don't have to save it, although I probably should, because that one little gap on that first thing, on the first one, whatever. So the other thing that is good to think about is, like in this case, I had a very short period of time to work on this. I think I had a few days overall for the entire project, which included some sound elements and editing. But this music piece was sort of like a centerpiece of the presentation. So I gave myself the time to work on that. but I only had about a day, maybe a day plus. So my initial pass is sort of messy. It's very, very specific. Um, so here's my initial pass, and it looks kind of like crazy, like what? But if you'll notice that there aren't any functions. So I didn't even bother trying to organize the project by functions. I just was like, hey, here's all my events. Let's just throw it together, and we'll just queue it off of here. But you'll start to look at patterns. You'll start to see patterns. Like here, all of these sort of look very similar, right? They're basically doing the same thing. There's just different data going into them. You can see I'm setting certain data. I'm just setting some values and so on and so forth. When my starting times are, what particular state I'm in, that sort of stuff. And so these could probably be encapsulated into a single function, right? But I was working quickly, so I didn't bother with that. And then I have some other stuff. It's sort of crazy. Anyway, I'm going to walk through this, but I'm going to walk through a much cleaned up version of it. And so something that I want to encourage all the sort of technical peeps out there, or if you're starting out and you're like, I'm learning to be more technical, one of the practices that you want to get into is once you work on a thing, sometimes, like I said, I had a very short window of time to work on this, and I had a very specific use case. But sometimes you can sit back later on and go, I could probably reuse some of that logic, right? Like that's some good work. And so you might say to yourself, okay, well, maybe I can generalize this system. And the more that you can generalize the system that you create, any system that you create, the more you can add to your toolbox of cool things that you've created and that you can always go back to speed up your workflow when you get crunchy again, right? So like, I think there's these moments where you're like, hey, I've got a lot of time and I want to experiment. And this is one of the things that's beautiful about blueprints is you can sort of prototype new ideas that you have, new interactive concepts, whatever you might want to, anything you can think of. But then at the same time, you can have like you could retain this library of scripts that you've created that you can go back to over and over again for various cases. And the more you can generalize it, the more you can go back to those. So it's always a good practice to try to think about how you could generalize something. So one of the things that I realized right off the bat when I was looking at this afterward, when I was doing sort of my own little post-mortem, was just how much data was very similar here. Like every time I was setting data, I was reading certain values, I was needing certain values, and I was setting certain values. And so I decided I needed a sort of be more conducive to my interactive music system, that I needed a data structure. And one of the cool things you can do in the Unreal Engine is actually create your own custom data structures. You just right-click under the blueprints thing, and you can see a structure here. And data structure is basically a structure of data that is just configured, whatever kind of data you want to package up, just a little package of data. And so for my case, I was like, hey, I wanted an easy way to say this was a looping segment or a non-looping segment. I think probably, thinking about it now, I probably want this to be a Boolean that's more like, hey, is this a transition segment or not? Because that sort of is more descriptive. I think, a sound wave, whether it's looping or not, I can actually query on the sound wave. So really what this is like is this a transition segment? And that's probably the way I should have used it, but this is the structure that I sort of built. Then I have a sound wave asset reference, right, for the actual sound wave. Right, so I had this idea, right, where I have a transition segment will have this, like, the main part of the transition and then an extra buffer. And so what I always wanted to do is I needed to know the length of that part, the part that doesn't include the loop. So that's pretty easy to like select in your DAW or like render out a file and just look at that part of the file and see how long it is in seconds. But I just needed a place that I could just write that down. And so I wrote that down here. I said, here's a float value of transition at duration, right? And then I created an array of integers that could act as like in my case, I had a very linear sequence, right? It was like introduction, loop, transition, loop. Always the same clip after. So the segments were very well ordered. But I thought, you know what? It's pretty easy to implement, say, like multiple potential exit clips. And so the idea here is to store all of the music in an array, an ordered array, and then just indicate indices on that array where I could go to the next thing, which means that I could have a much more complex interactive music pathway than just linear. And then I just needed some sort of state information. In this case, I decided on a string. A string would probably be not as useful as, say, an enumeration, but I wanted it to be general use case. So I don't know. Maybe this was, I don't know. Maybe this part is sort of questionable. But I did it as a convenience for the user interface for the little demonstration here. So yeah, so here's my general music manager, and if I go into event graph, you can see it's much more well organized. Look at that, with comments and everything. Very nice. And the idea that I had was like, okay, I have this general music manager, but then I want to be able to use polymorphism, which is a programming concept of child and parent objects and inherited properties, and use that to customize an object to a specific type of music cue. Because, there is, like, when it comes down to it, there is no general interactive music system. Like, you can think of systems that are very broad in their approach or strategy, their philosophy, but in reality, no music cue should be constricted to a single philosophy, right? And so you want the opportunity to be able to override ideas. If you have like a general idea and you're like, oh, generally I want to do this, but there's obviously exceptions to the rule all the time. And so you want to be able to, what's nice about blueprint objects is that like a normal programming class, they support child classes. And so I can create this general music manager, and then I can create the kite music manager based off of this as a child object of that. And as a child object of it, it will have all of the same properties and abilities, but I can do things like override a function and do it differently than the default way and create brand new logic. And so I think that's super powerful. Like you can sit here and go, okay, here's a general use case that covers maybe 80% of the type of music you might want to do. And then you can build that system and just have it. But then there's the exceptions, and you want to have something flexible, and that's what's cool about blueprints is that it's that flexibility that just sort of adds a little bit of like creativity to your palette. Like you can just say, hey, I'm going to do something different for this particular cue or just this particular case. So let me walk through this, and I'll show you how I approach this or organize this. So the music manager is going to be taking information in from some other part of the game. In this case, for this demonstration, I just link up a user interface, like an actual user interface, and then you just go play, stop, and continue. But, in an actual game situation, that information could be coming from other parts of the game script, right? The game script will have, say, hooks that are like... So I can create these hooks inside of my script that I can then implement in other parts of the game, or synchronize with designers and they can build them in, right? Whatever the relationship is with the team. And it's very handy. Like, for example, on this project, I actually created a bunch of events, and I was like, here are the events. Here's the list of events, and you just call those events, and they'll do the thing, And then for him, it was just like, okay, spawn the music manager, play this event, play this event, play this event, and it was just like, there you go. It was very easy for him to plug into it. So you want to think about that sometimes when you're organizing or creating general use case. Um, but I have some basic events here. I just start music manager, stop music manager, and then transition music. And maybe that should have been transition music manager. But anyways, transition music. Then I have a couple of delegates, and I'll talk about those in a second. And then I just have my classic debug. I always like to have a debug printout of various things that I'm diagnosing while I'm working on it, if I run into things. And so I usually, most of the classes that I build, I'll add a little debug bool that I can turn on or off. It's public, and then if it's on, then it'll print out information about that object. I always find that really useful, but I don't want to print that information out all the time. So only when I'm asking for it. um, all right, so the idea is that some other thing in the game system will be saying, "Hey, start the music manager." So once that event is called, it will say, "Okay, set the actor tick enabled." I actually don't enable the tick by default because if I have debug on, I don't want it to start spitting out debug information until it's ready to do that. I don't want it to start doing things until. So I don't want it to tick at all until it's playing. So then when it started, I start the tick on. I set some default values, right? Some state information. Is this an ending segment, which I found was an edge case for my advancing the music segment clips. Is this object playing? And then I have a function for selecting the starting music cue. Now the default behavior in this is to take my music array, which is just an array of that data structure that I showed you, and then just select the first index. But as a function, it could be overridden by a child object and have brand new behavior for how it selects the starting cue. Maybe it selects from a random set of them. I don't know. The logic is overridable, and that's what's cool. So the default is to just grab the first index, and then I spit that element out, and I say play this music cue with the playback start time at 0, so it starts from the beginning, and I don't want to fade. So no crossfade. And then I take that information in, I grab some data about it. So for the fade time, I actually do a little trick. Boolean variables, when turned into, because they're Boolean variables are true or false, but when they're turned into numbers, are 1 or 0. So I can take this public variable, which is called crossfade seconds, and crossfade seconds is like, how long should crossfades be for this particular piece of music? Any given music cue might be conducive to longer or shorter crossfades. It has to do with the kind of material that's inside the music. Some, like if your music is like got a lot of really sharp edges, on the waveform contours, then maybe a sharper fade is a shorter fade is more appropriate. It all depends. So it's something that you want to be able to parameterize. But because in this case I said fade false, then I can multiply that. I turn it into 1 or 0. As false, it's 0. I multiply it by my fade, and then I have my local fade time, which is just part of this little function. And it will be 0 if the fade is false, and if the fade is true, then it'll be whatever the crossfade seconds parameter is. Then I grab the, see here, this is where I was like, yeah, maybe that should be is transition. So here we have, I just say, hey, is this a transition or is it a looping segment? And then I just store that information for later. And then I grab the duration and I get the value of the percentage. So basically, if we look at my loop here, say this transition right here from introduction, this line threshold is some percentage through this wave file. I don't know how long, right? The system doesn't know how long until we tell it. But it's some percentage through. And so I have the time of this, right? I've added that to my data structure. And I know the duration of the wave file itself because I can query that from the system. So all I need to do is just divide that first value over the second value, and I get a percentage, or 0 to 1, right? Some sort of fractional ratio. So I get a percentage, and that's going to be my threshold for transitioning into the loop. Then I do a couple things, and this could probably be cleaned up. This could probably be more generalized. Right now I have this sort of checkerboard system where I'm doing non-looping sections with looping sections and non-looping sections and looping sections. And so I have, because I needed to be able to control two different sound waves that played at the same time, and I needed to control them independent of one another, I needed two audio components. So I have built in a non-looping segment audio component and a looping segment audio component. But it could be, because really all I'm thinking about is interleaving. So a more generalized strategy might be to say, just have, a 1 and 2, or an A and B, and then just constantly alternate A and B, regardless of whether it's a looping or non-looping segment. Because it's possible to have maybe a train of non-looping segments, which could be really cool. So that's something to think about, I guess. That might be an opportunity to even generalize this further. But at the moment I don't, and so I just say, hey, which one is playing right now based on whether this is a transition or not, and I set that value, and then I do a crossfade. I give it the fade in component, so the component that's fading in, the component that's fading out. I pass in the sound wave to play on the fade in component, and then the time to execute that fade. Remember, that could be 0, right? And then the time to start playing it. So if I have to seek into the file, remember, if I'm playing here and I'm somewhere in this area, I just need to figure out how far in from this threshold to where I am currently to start seeking into this entry point. So I just want to make sure that I'm lined up correctly. So I'm seeking into the file a little bit. All right. And then if we look at that function, it's really super simple, right? I just set the sound wave on one of the audio components. I fade in that audio component. I give it some fade values, and I fade out the other one, right? And the fade out automatically stops it when it's done. So in this case, super simple. The default behavior is super simple. Now, a caveat, something to think about, is that, and why I made it its own function, even though it's very simple, is because the fade in and fade out functions are linear. So it's possible that you may have a music cue where a linear crossfade is just not going to work. And in those cases, you'll need to do something else. And so that's what I actually did for this. I actually overrode this function, and I'll show it to you when we get to the child component. But anyway, going back to the play, we're almost done with that. And then we're done, and then we return, hey, what is our percent threshold, and is this a transition? We go back to our event graph, and then we just fill that data in to data that's available here. And then we select our next music cue, and that is its own function, because maybe there's, obviously that would be something, behavior that you'd want to override. In this case, I had obviously a very sequential selection approach, but it was very easy for me to build in a random selection. So I built that in. I just happened to only have one value every time. But the way that it works is it says, hey, give me that current music structure, the currently playing one. What are your exit destinations? And then I just do a random grab, and then I just say, okay, well, pass that into the music array, and then grab that as the next music element. So this is just grabbing, like I could have a segment where it's like, hey, this segment could exit into index 3, or it could exit into index 5, or exit, whatever. And then it would randomly select. Now, if I want a different behavior, I could override this. It is its own function, right? I'm just setting up a default behavior. It could be like a sequence that counts through or something like that, or it could be like state information, like always pick the zero one of the array to like, because it's low state or high state, medium state, whatever. Um, so that's just selecting the next music cue, and then we have stop music. So if the user stops the music, or if the system is done and it stops itself, we just hit the stop music cue function, which does a fade out of the currently playing cues, or all the cues really. And that could be overridden. Then we say, hey, it's no longer playing, and then I just give a little bit of a delay, and then I say disable the tick on this actor. So it lets the tick play a couple, a frame or so before it's done ticking, and then we're done. Now, if we get a transition, say if the user says, give me a transition, we just determine, hey, are we currently transitioning? If we are not currently transitioning, then we are now transitioning, okay? And then we just make sure that this is not an ending segment, and that we are currently playing. Because if we're not playing, then we actually don't want to do anything. And then if all that stuff's good, all those checks pass, then we just calculate the time for our next transition. And otherwise, this is very similar. You see play, and then I set my values, and then I pick the next cue. I play, I set my values, and I pick the next cue. There's just some extra stuff here, and I'll show you what I did. So first of all, I need to calculate so I'm ready to transition. What is the start time I want to start my next music cue? Right? Because I have this possibility that I could hit this threshold and there might be some margin of error there. And so I just need to take that into account when I'm starting my next cue. So I do. And I just calculate that. But it's also possible, especially if I'm leaving a loop, that I'm leaving the loop in the middle of the loop, right? If I'm, like, let's say this loop is 2 seconds long, and I'm 1 second into the loop, right? I need to know that. So if I click, hey, if the user's like, transition the music, move to the next thing, I need to leave my loop, then it's possible that I could be like, say, a second in. And so I have to account for that. And I say, okay, we'll start a second in. So, don't start from the beginning. That way they're lined up. So I just need to calculate that. And there's lots of different cases that might take into account, what the timing is. So here's the calculation for that. I just determine, am I looping or not? Because if I'm looping or not, then I need to start from the beginning. And if I'm not looping, then I need to start it from that other thing, right? This threshold here. So I get that transition at duration. I get the current duration of the sound playing. Then I get my current playing percent, so whatever that value is, and I multiply them together. So the current playing percent is going to be a value of 0 to 1, and the duration is going to be the length of the entire wave file. And so if I multiply those together, I will get my current playing time. And then I just subtract that little extra bit, right? Because if I'm like right here, for example, then I need to get, so this is my percentage. Let's say I'm 90% through this file, and this thing is like 80%, right? So I just need to get that 90%, and then I subtract the 80%, and I get 10%. And 10% in is the time that I start this file in. I need to convert it to time because the next file could be a different length, and so the percentages won't line up. So I just convert it to time. And then I add a latency offset. So this is a tweakable, right? This is something that I tuned. I noticed a latency that I suspect has to do with the frame latency from going to the audio thread and coming back to the round trip, basically, from to and from the audio thread. And so I take the delta of this last frame and I multiply it by 2. And if I have a consistent frame rate, this should be good. However, this could be problematic if I had a huge hitch right before right before this execution. So, that's something to concern about. Maybe that would be something we want to change. Maybe I want to change how I calculate the start time of the next playing segment, in which case I would just override this function. It's all project dependent, right? So I might have a different approach to that. And then I just take into account, what if there's like a really long delay and my padding has overshot my loop. I don't know, maybe it's possible. So I just do a modulus to wrap it around the loop length. And then I pass that in. So then here I get the start time for the next transition. And then I have this percentage offset, which is a little bit of a bug. And I'll talk to Aaron when he gets back from GDC. Maybe we can fix that. But, sometimes you run into these bugs and you just work around it. That's something that just a skill you want to develop, is working around bugs. It's true. Because you don't want that to stop you. And this was a simple one I found. I just discovered that when I started into the middle of a transition segment, I was having issues lining up the percentages, and that's because the percentages counted from the start of the playing instead of the start of the playing as it relates to the whole file. So I just account for the offset from starting into the middle of the file, and then I add that to my next threshold. Basically, I say, here's my next threshold. I subtract the little offset, and that's when I'll actually start the next thing. This was not something I noticed on the project when I was working on it. It's just something that I noticed when I was sort of generalizing this. Because I actually, if you look at my old one, I actually did this a little bit differently, and I'll show you the next section. That was one of the major changes that I made when I generalized this. And then I just want to say, hey, is this a transitioning segment? And then I select my next music cue, just like I select up here. So then I have my delegates. One of the things that I keep track of is how far along am I in this particular segment. I always want to know what percentage through I am playing. And so we have a delegate where you can spit out, what is my playback percent? And this is the thing that's that I just account for with that percent offset when I set my threshold. But basically, I set a threshold on the non-looping segment or the transition segments of my audio component. I say when I reach when the playback percentage exceeds my transition threshold, when the playback percentage is past this point, then I'm ready to transition into my loop. And then I do a simple gate here. This could probably be approached differently. This is something that maybe there are edge cases here I haven't considered. But basically, I just do a little gate, and then I just run through a transition. So it automatically transitions into the loop once it's hit that threshold. That's basically what this is doing. And then on the looping percentage, I track the looping percentage, but I wrap the looping percentage around a modulus. So the percentage, because it's a looping section, the playback percent actually continues counting. What's cool is that you can actually keep track of how many times it loops, which I think is actually pretty rad. But for this data, I just needed to keep track of the actual playback percent of the file, and so I just wrap that percentage around a modulus of 1, and then feed that in. And then I just had a case up here where, like, what if, and this wasn't possible in the original project, but I ran into this idea when I was generalizing it, and I was like, what if the user inputs continue before the segment is done transitioning? Which is to say, what if we're in this transition and they say, move forward, but I haven't even transitioned into the loop, so I'm not ready to pass that section yet. Well, I just want to say, hey, transition when you're ready, and then when I'm in the loop, I'll be ready to transition. And so I did that. I had this bool. It's like, if I'm not transitioning, then transition, right? But if I'm trying to transition and I am transitioning already, then just transition when you're ready. And so this bool gets set true, and then you'll see down here is that when I am set to transition when I'm ready, um, then I do a little delay. Basically, that is to say I let myself have some padding before I begin my transition out of the loop. So if I go, hey, I'm ready to transition, but I'm still in the middle of transitioning, then it's just, hey, transition when you're ready. And then when you're actually start transitioning, or when we've moved into the loop section, then wait some time, just wait a little bit of time, and then transition to the next thing automatically. That's the idea here. So, and then the last thing I have is a tick, which is my debug. Oh, I already mentioned that. So I have debug information, prints out debug. And then I think this thing I ended up using this for debugging information. I just get the clock time at the time of the transition just to see, where am I at. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. That's a good walkthrough. So if we look at the actual, the one for the actual piece of music, right? Because I said it was a child object. So in blueprints, if you right-click on your blueprint, you can see an option to create a child blueprint class, and that will just basically create a child blueprint that will inherit all of the properties of that blueprint, but then it will let you override things about your own blueprint or create new functionality or expand on it, right? And so here I have this child component that has a custom array of predefined music information, right? Here's my data structure with all my information in it, and then I just pass that in. So the first thing I do is I just pass that in to my music array in, and then I spin up a little UI because I just figure, hey, this thing because it's for this project, I can just spin up a UI and it can own that UI, and then I have my tick, and I just do a little UI update on the tick. And then here's my overridden crossfade. Remember, my crossfade was linear. And so here, I wanted to do a crossfade that was smoother. So I use a timeline. But basically, it's very simple. I just have the fade-in component, the fade-out component, the sound wave, the fade-in time, the playback time. I just set the play rate of the crossfade, the timeline. I adjust that to play rate based on the time of the crossfade. And then I just do fade in. I just feed the fade value to the fade in, which goes from 0 to 1. And then I just take 1 and minus that fade value to go from 1 to 0 for the fade out audio component. And then when it's done, I just stop that one audio component, the fade out audio component. So pretty simple, but I felt like in this music, a little smoother curve here worked better than a linear curve. So yeah, if everything worked out all right, everything should play. So we'll check it out. All right. So I hit play. And here's where it's updating the UI. You can see that sort of progress bar. There you go. Now we're in our loop. And so we could sit here for a little while and experience the loop, whatever our thing is. And then when we're ready to leave the loop, we just hit continue. And it automatically transitions out. It transitions immediately. And then we're in our next loop. And because I'm doing the transition immediately, I'm not trying to count any bars, I'm not trying to count any beats, I don't have to worry about rubato. The music can flow and tempo can flow and do its thing, and I don't have to worry about that. The only thing that I need to tweak is that maybe the crossfade, depends on the type of music, like what kind of instruments are playing. That's just regular editing. I could probably adjust that crossfade curve a little more to tweak it, because I heard a little bit of a dip in volume. So I'll try to land it in the middle, so you can see it's like got some boundaries there. So yeah, it's a little bit of a dip. I could probably tweak that crossfade a little more, and then we have our finale. All right. So, so there you go. This project is down at the booth. You can check it out. Please do. I won't be there to walk you through it, so you'll have to bug Ethan. But make sure that you ask him lots of informed questions and put him on the spot. It'd be great. But yeah. So I hope this was helpful, educational, interesting. I don't know. Cool. Thanks. Everyone have a great day.